1863. A year of gains for the Union and for the Church. The Adventists will organize their General Conference and begin pursuit of a health message that addresses the suffering of their day. Great battles will be fought at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, and Abraham Lincoln will finally issue the Emancipation Proclamation as he had promised the previous year.
A proclamation. I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves in any state where the people are in rebellion against the United States henceforward shall be free. By the President, Abraham Lincoln.
With a stroke of his pen, the President frees millions of slaves in the rebelling southern states. Of course, not everyone agrees exactly on what the Emancipation Proclamation does.
For the radicals, the abolitionists, it was not enough. It was too long in duration. It didn't cover enough. It was not enough. It is wrong. To the conservatives, it was too much. Way beyond you've changed the nature of the war. They understood the war nature had been changed. Now, it is actually surprisingly effective.
Lincoln's document provides the legal framework for the emancipation of over 3 million slaves in the Confederate States as the Union armies advance.
Now, Lincoln knew, though, he looked at bits of paper, so okay, this is worth nothing unless we have another amendment that enforces it, the 13th Amendment, which he would have a big hand in beginning the drafting stages of it.
In the South, as slaves hear about the Emancipation Proclamation, they begin to take action.
We went to the master's house. An officer made a little speech and then read the Emancipation Proclamation. We were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. For some minutes, there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy. Then the great responsibility of being free seemed to take possession. The questions of a home, a living, the rearing of children, education, citizenship, and the establishment of churches. To some, it seemed that now that they were in actual possession of it, freedom was a more serious thing than they had expected to find it. Booker T. Washington.
In Marion, Iowa, a group fractures from the Adventist body. Borrowing the language of the war, the Review and Herald reports on the rebel conference. The schism is contentious, with heated discussion addressing the issues that have been raised. Adventist leaders seek unity, but ultimately the Review and Herald reports the secession movement in Iowa has left the church. Nationally, the Conscription Act, with its compulsory enlistment, is a challenge for the Seventh-day Adventists. Fewer men are volunteering, and the Union must find new ways of bolstering their numbers. The solution? The very first federal draft in American history.
And as you get larger armies, you need to try to figure out how to fill those armies. And so the idea of the draft, or the idea of conscription, comes into play.
Lincoln knows how many men are being spent. And I use that word carefully, killed. We've lost. Both sides have lost. The South has been conscripting men already. They have been pulling men into the armed forces. They've been drafting as well.
On March 3, Lincoln signs the Enrollment or Conscription Act. It requires the enrollment of male citizens and immigrants between ages 20 and 45. These men are now eligible to be drafted or conscripted into the Union military. Controversially, the Act allows draftees to hire a substitute or to exempt themselves from service by paying a commutation fee of $300. Across the North, people hate the new draft. In particular, the substitution and commutation policies lead to the popular slogan, "Rich man's war, poor man's fight." In some places, the resentment grows so bitter that riots break out, most notably the infamous New York draft riots, which take place July 13 through 16. For the Adventists, the issue of conscription has been a subject of discussion for some time. James White raised the topic the previous year with his controversial article, "The Nation."
He argued that for Christians to be involved in a war is a violation of two of God's laws. It is a violation of the commandment to not kill, and it could interfere with the Sabbath commandment. He said for those two reasons, the Adventist should not be actively involved in war.
You see, at the time James White is writing, the time the Civil War is kicking off, there are some war hawks in Ohio, like Joseph Clark, who will admit later, well, you know, I got a little too worked up on this, and it hurt my Christian witness. And then out in Iowa, there are some pretty strong pacifists out there that don't think we ought to vote, hold public office, get involved in any way to support the Civil War. So James White is kind of, searching between these two poles, the war hawks and the doves. Where should the church stand?
And so you had pacifists arguing, we should never join the army and take lives of other people under any circumstance. Then you had others saying, well, wait a minute, this is a just war. We want to fight for our rights. That helped them formulate a concept of conscientious objection.
Since the creation of the Michigan Conference in 1861, several new state conferences have been formed. Now the Church decides it needs a more central organization that will bring the state conferences together. In May 1863, the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists is formed.
For the purpose of securing unity and efficiency in labor, and promoting the general interests of the cause of present truth, and of perfecting the organization of the Seventh-day Adventists, we, the delegates from the several state conferences, hereby proceed to organize a general conference and adopt the following Constitution for the government thereof.
And so they came together, they chose their delegates. We already had the name Seventh-day Adventist, and it was decided that we would have a general conference. They felt they had a world work to do. It was growing to that. And so for them, the thought of a general conference at that point was a natural development.
Perhaps no previous meeting that we have ever enjoyed was characterized by such unity of feeling and harmony of sentiment. In all the important steps taken at this conference, in the organization of a general conference, and the further perfecting of state conferences, there was not a dissenting voice, and we may reasonably doubt if there was even a dissenting thought. The influence of this meeting cannot fail to be good. As we separated to go to our homes, courage and good cheer seemed to be the unanimous feelings.
1863 is pivotal in another way for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And that is, it's the beginning in a very powerful way of the health message, as it came to be called.
In Otsego, Michigan, on June 6, 1863, right in the center of the Civil War, Ellen received a very pivotal vision on health.
I call it a 3D vision: dress, drugs, and diet. And it wasn't long after that they thought they ought to do something regarding health.
Now, I find that it's interesting that God chose to give her this vision at this time, right here in the middle of the Civil War years. Certainly there was suffering all around.
I mean, you had cholera epidemics, you had the consistent deadly effect of consumption, as they called it, which was tuberculosis. There were diphtheria epidemics. There was just illness and disease and lifestyle even issues dramatically affected people, and Adventists were dying and other people died.
Actually, even though some of what Ellen White said had already been stated by some health reformers, Much of what she said following this health reform vision was revolutionary and may have done a great deal to reduce the suffering of the times.
In June, Confederate General Robert E. Lee decides to take the war to the north. The Union Army reacts, and on July 1, the forces meet at the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The three-day battle is the bloodiest of the war. Over 160,000 troops are engaged, and by battle's end, over 50,000 casualties litter the fields, ridges, and dens of Gettysburg. In the Western Theater, General Ulysses S. Grant captures the stronghold of Vicksburg on July 4, Independence Day, securing the mighty Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. With success at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the tide of war begins to turn for the Union Army. In the fall, personal tragedy once more strikes the White family.
Battle Creek, Michigan, December 15, 1863. After mailing the last paper, we received the sad intelligence that Brother White's eldest son, Henry N., was very sick with lung fever in Topsham, Maine. Subsequent reports showed him to be rapidly failing. Until now, we are compelled to make the still more painful announcement of his death, which occurred on the 8th. We have just received a telegraphic dispatch stating that they will return immediately, and the funeral will be held here in Battle Creek next Sabbath, the 19th.
This was a tremendous loss to both James and Ellen. I think Ellen grieved for her son, Henry, for the rest of her life.
A funeral is held in Battle Creek, and Henry is buried, as he requested, next to his young brother, John Herbert, who had died 3 years earlier.
But before he passed away, he made things right with the Lord. And he said he wanted to be buried in Battle Creek next to his little brother, John Herbert. And if you go out to the cemetery today, you'll see James and Ellen White's grave, and then John Herbert and Henry's.
On November 2, 1863, Abraham Lincoln receives an invitation from David Wills, an organizer of the new National Cemetery at Gettysburg, requesting that he come and set apart these grounds to their sacred use by a few appropriate remarks. Mary begs Lincoln not to go, as their youngest son, 10-year-old Tad, is ill, and Lincoln himself is in the early stages of what will be diagnosed as a case of smallpox. In Gettysburg, Lincoln tours the battlefield, and amidst the fresh graves and the rising stench of death, Lincoln addresses the tens of thousands of people with his now famous speech.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here. But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.